I had been driving for hours, the kind of long, endless stretch where the highway seems to go on forever, and the only signs of life are the occasional gas station or diner. I missed the last exit I had planned to take before the roads narrowed and the streetlights disappeared, and by the time I realized it, I was already well past it. My eyes were sore from the bright lights of oncoming traffic, my body stiff and tired from sitting in the driver's seat for so long. I needed a break, a place to rest before continuing. That's when I saw the tiny motel, almost hidden among a line of trees, a single flickering neon sign announcing vacancy. Its parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered near the rooms, and the building itself had the kind of faded look that suggested it had been there for decades. I parked my car near the office, shut off the engine, and stretched my legs. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt, and something else I couldn't place, maybe the faint rot of leaves from the trees around the lot. The office was small, with a dimly lit counter and a half-empty candy shelf. I paid quickly, wanting nothing more than to get to my room, and drove slowly along the narrow strip of pavement toward the back, where my room was. The lot was so quiet it almost felt wrong. Every step, every engine hum, echoed across the asphalt. I parked outside the room, checked the locks, and tried to shake off the strange feeling that had begun to settle in my chest. I had been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke suddenly. My ears caught it first, the sharp, piercing sound of a car alarm going off. At first, I thought it was mine, a car alarm being triggered by the cold or a faulty sensor. But as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and looked out the window, I realized it wasn't. Across the lot, a car I didn't recognize had its doors wide open, engine running, alarm blaring into the dark night. It sat there in the pale glow of the single, flickering streetlight, completely empty, as if someone had just vanished from it in the middle of starting their car. Groggy, annoyed, and a little nervous, I pulled on my shoes and grabbed a flashlight from my bag. The motel was silent, except for the distant sound of the alarm. The asphalt under my feet felt cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I moved closer. My flashlight cut a narrow beam across the lot. The shadows from the single overhead lamp were long and shifting, and every corner seemed darker than the last. That's when I saw it, a figure standing under the far light. At first, I thought it might be someone checking the car, maybe a guest, but there was something about it that didn't make sense. The figure was perfectly still, completely upright, facing toward the lot but not moving its head, just standing there like it was part of the shadow itself. I flicked my flashlight toward it, expecting the beam to illuminate someone, to reveal a confused stranger or a lost traveler, but the moment the light touched the figure, it disappeared. I blinked and swung the beam around, but there was nothing. No movement, no trace of anyone. I checked the lot again, my heart beating faster now, my stomach tightening. The open car, the empty lot, the quiet motel office a few dozen feet away, all of it felt wrong. My instincts screamed at me to go back inside, lock the door, and not look again, but something made me keep glancing toward where the figure had been. I never saw it again. I stayed outside, keeping my distance from both cars, my flashlight sweeping across the lot, but nothing moved. I could hear the faint hum of the motel's refrigerator through the windows, the occasional drip of condensation from the air conditioning units. Every now and then, a distant car would pass by on the road, headlights briefly illuminating the empty spaces between rooms. It was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was tense, the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing sound loud and intrusive. I didn't dare approach my car. The alarm continued, the sound echoing off the motel walls, a harsh reminder that someone, or something, had been there. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, someone screwing with the alarm for fun. But the fact that the figure had been there, still and silent, made that feel less likely. I thought about calling the police, but the thought of them driving out to a near-empty motel in the middle of the night, maybe too late to see anything, seemed pointless. I stayed inside the room, door locked, flashlight ready, eyes glued to the window. Every time a shadow moved across the lot from the flickering light, I jumped, heart in my throat. Time seemed to stretch, each minute long and heavy. I thought about sleep, about trying to rest until morning, but my body refused to calm down. Every sound was amplified. Every passing car seemed to carry more threat than it should have. Eventually, the alarm stopped, though I never saw anyone leave the empty car. I stayed by the window anyway, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I checked every lock, every window latch, moving quietly so as not to make a sound. I even set a chair against the door handle, though it was probably just a small deterrent. The hours crawled by, the sky gradually shifting from black to gray as the first hints of morning began to show over the horizon. Light crept slowly across the lot, revealing every crack in the asphalt, every faded line marking a parking space, and yet the memory of the figure lingered. Even in the growing daylight, the lot felt too quiet, too exposed. When the sun finally rose fully, I could see the cars in the lot more clearly, the small motel office, the few scattered trees around the perimeter. I checked my own car first, running my hands over the doors and locks, making sure nothing had been tampered with. Everything was fine. I stepped outside cautiously, still keeping an eye on the lot. There was no sign of the other car or the figure, just empty asphalt and the hum of a distant highway. I made my way back to my room, gathered my things quickly, and checked out without hesitation. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the lot or a car following me. But there was nothing. The motel receded behind me, the empty lot stretching out beneath the rising sun, and I finally allowed myself to relax a little. I thought about what had happened, about the figure, about the open car with the alarm blaring, and I realized that I had no explanation. Someone had been there, close enough to trigger my fear, and then they were gone. The memory of it stayed with me, a quiet reminder of how quickly a place that seems safe can feel anything but. By the time I had reached the next town, my heartbeat had slowed, and the adrenaline that had kept me on edge began to fade. I thought about breakfast, about the road ahead, and about how I would never stay at that motel again. The experience stayed with me for weeks afterward, a story I would replay in my mind, each time remembering the silent figure under the flickering light, the empty car, and the long, tense hours until sunrise. It was over, I told myself, but the memory of that night, the way the quiet felt alive and dangerous, would never leave me. I pulled into the motel parking lot just as the last light of the sun was fading. I had been driving for 8 hours straight, my eyes sore from staring at the road, my back aching from the seat. The motel looked tired, old paint peeling in places, the neon sign flickering intermittently. I could see that most of the parking spots were empty, and the few cars that were there looked like they had been sitting for weeks. I didn't care. I just wanted a bed and a shower. The lobby was dimly lit, the kind of dull yellow light that makes everything look older and smaller. The clerk barely looked up from the register when I walked in. He handed me the key without a word, and I noticed the lack of movement around the office. There was no hum of conversation, no smell of coffee or breakfast, just the faint chemical scent of cleaning supplies. The hallway to my room was narrow and smelled faintly of mildew and old carpet. Each step I took echoed softly. I thought about how quiet it was, how empty, and it made me slightly uneasy, but I pushed the feeling away. I just needed to get out of my clothes and into the shower. The room itself was plain and small. A king-sized bed, though the mattress had seen better days. The sheets were clean but felt thin and scratchy. There was a small desk shoved into one corner, a tiny television on a low dresser, and a single chair. I put my bags down and went straight to the bathroom. The shower was hot and strong, the water washing away the tension of the day. Afterward, I wrapped myself in the thin motel towels and collapsed onto the bed. I was out almost immediately. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was quiet, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound. Then I heard it, the soft click of the door lock turning. My stomach dropped. I froze under the covers, my body tensing. The sound repeated slowly, deliberate, like someone was unlocking the door from the outside. My mind raced. I hadn't checked the door before falling asleep, but the thought of it being unlocked never occurred to me. I stayed as still as I could, trying to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it. But then the door opened slightly, just enough for a shadow to stretch across the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the person could hear it. I could hear soft, steady breathing, low and quiet. Whoever it was didn't move much at first, just stood there in the dim light coming from the hallway. My mind went through every scenario I could think of, robbery, assault, worse. I couldn't move, couldn't call out. I remembered the fire extinguisher under the sink. I grabbed it quietly, holding it like a club, my hands shaking. I kept my eyes on the door. For what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, I stayed frozen, holding my breath, waiting. I could hear faint movements outside in the parking lot, the crunch of gravel under shoes, the shifting of tires. The shadow at the door moved slightly, then disappeared. I waited longer, trying to convince myself it was safe, but every small sound made me jump. Finally, I got enough courage to creep toward the window. I saw a figure moving across the parking lot, slipping behind the cars. Whoever it had gone. My door had been unlocked, and I realized with a mix of relief and anger that the front desk must have left it that way by mistake. The thought made my skin crawl. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, wrapped in a blanket, clutching the fire extinguisher like a lifeline. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. Every creak of the building, every rustle outside, made my heart jump. I tried to distract myself by focusing on small things, the pattern of the carpet, the flicker of the air conditioning light, but nothing worked. My mind kept replaying the image of that shadow at the door, standing there silently, just waiting. By the first light of dawn, I decided I couldn't stay another second. I dressed quickly, grabbed my things, and went to the lobby. The clerk was there, the same bored expression on his face, as if nothing had happened. I paid for the room without a word, my hands still shaking, and left. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following, but the lot was empty, the neon sign flickering like it had all night. Even though I was safe, the memory stayed with me. I kept thinking about how close it had been, how easily someone could have gotten into my room. The quiet, the emptiness, the way the shadow had moved. It all felt like it had been waiting for me to let my guard down. I promised myself that I would never stay in a quiet, empty motel alone again. From that night on, I made a rule. If a motel felt too quiet, if the clerk seemed distracted or the room felt off, I would leave. No amount of convenience or exhaustion was worth that kind of fear. Looking back, I realize how small mistakes can become dangerous. One unlocked door, one moment of inattention, could have changed everything. The motel was normal in the daylight, the rooms clean, the parking lot empty but harmless. But at night, when no one was around and the building seemed to hold its breath, it became something else entirely. It became a place where you could feel completely exposed, vulnerable to whoever might decide to take advantage of a simple error. I eventually returned home, but the feeling of being watched lingered for weeks. I double-checked every lock, every window, every door in my own apartment. I learned to trust my instincts more, to recognize that quiet isn't always peaceful, that emptiness can hide danger. That night at the motel stayed with me not because anything happened, but because it could have. I still drive past motels now, especially the empty, quiet ones, and I feel a shiver run through me, remembering the sound of the lock turning and the shadow standing in my doorway. I never want to feel that powerless again, and I make sure to be careful, always aware, always prepared. That trip taught me something important. Fear isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about real people and real mistakes. It's about being alone in a place that seems safe until it isn't. And I've never forgotten that lesson. I had been driving for almost 10 hours straight after finishing a late shift at work. By the time I reached the small roadside motel, I was completely exhausted, my body aching from the long day, and my mind barely keeping up with my own thoughts. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, casting a tired red glow across the cracked pavement. I parked my car, climbed out, and stretched, feeling every knot in my back and shoulders. I wasn't picky about where I stayed, and at that point, any bed would do. The motel didn't look like much. Its paint was peeling, and the doors along the hallway were chipped and scuffed. The place smelled faintly of something damp, a smell I had gotten used to after so many nights in cheap motels during long work trips. I didn't even flinch as I walked up to the front desk, paid for the night, and took my key. The room itself was small and plain. The carpet was worn, with stains that seemed to have been there for years, and the bedspread was thin and threadbare. There was a desk with a small lamp that gave off a weak yellow light, a dresser with drawers that stuck slightly when I tried to open them, and a small TV mounted on the wall. I set my bags down, stripped off my work clothes, and took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the exhaustion. The tiles were cracked and slightly grimy. The drain had a faint smell, but it didn't matter. I just wanted to get clean and collapse. Afterward, I brushed my teeth, changed into a t-shirt and sweatpants, and crawled into the bed. For a while, the room seemed normal. The ceiling fan turned lazily above me, and the faint hum of the air conditioning unit filled the background. I closed my eyes, expecting to drift off quickly, but after a few minutes, I noticed a faint smell. At first, I thought it was the mildew that usually lingered in old motels, the kind that made you wrinkle your nose but didn't make you leave. But this was different. The smell was sharper, harder to place, and it seemed to grow stronger the longer I stayed still. I lifted my head, sniffing the air, trying to identify it. It was like a mixture of smoke and something rotting, something organic and heavy that made the back of my throat tighten. I got out of bed, pulling the blanket around me like a shield, and began searching. The smell was strongest near the corner of the room, right where the air conditioning unit was mounted in the window. I crouched down and looked underneath. At first, I saw nothing, just the shadow of the unit and the small gap between the floor and the wall. Then my eyes caught a thin, dark stain trailing from the vent into the wall. It wasn't fresh, but it was unmistakable. Something had leaked through the unit, something that had been sitting there for a long time. The smell made my stomach turn. I moved closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The dark stain wasn't large, but its presence was undeniable. I pulled back slightly and studied the rest of the room, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. The sheets were clean enough, the towels looked freshly folded, and the rest of the carpet didn't have anything noticeable. But the smell was still there, growing heavier now, almost like it was seeping into everything around me. My mind ran through all the possibilities. Mold, something dead in the vent, old water damage, or maybe some kind of decay that had been trapped in the air conditioning unit for years. Whatever it was, it had been there long before I arrived. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from the air, but from the thought that I had been sleeping in the same room as whatever had caused that smell. I couldn't stay there any longer, at least not in the dark. I left the lights on and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to figure out what to do. The smell was overwhelming when I closed my eyes and tried to relax, so I kept them open, staring at the peeling wallpaper and the small table with the phone and the plastic cup left from the previous guests. Every few minutes, I would lean over and sniff the air again, trying to track the source. It was relentless, a constant presence that seemed to press against me. I debated calling the front desk, but the thought of explaining what I had found, or worse, having to spend the night in that room while someone came to inspect it, made my stomach knot even tighter. I ended up sitting there for hours, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional car passing by on the highway. My mind raced with possibilities, imagining mold so thick it had soaked into the walls, or worse, some forgotten animal or food that had rotted and seeped into the vent. I stayed awake until the sun began to rise, sitting on the bed with my knees pulled up, feeling trapped in the room by something I couldn't even see. When morning came, I packed my things as quickly as I could, leaving behind all of the items I had unpacked. I left the lights on, opened the door, and took one last deep breath of the air. The smell was still there, faint in the daylight, but unmistakable. I walked to my car, jumped in, and started the engine. I didn't look back. The whole drive out of that area, I kept thinking about the stain under the air conditioning unit and the smell that had clung to the sheets and carpet. Even hours later, I could still sense it, like it had latched onto my clothes, my hair, and my skin. I made a mental note never to return to that motel. On the highway, I thought about how often people stay in places like that without realizing what's lurking just out of sight. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost, and it didn't require a dramatic story to make it frightening. It was just real, the kind of fear that comes from knowing something is wrong, from sensing decay and neglect and the traces of something left behind. It was a reminder that even the simplest, most mundane places could be uncomfortable or dangerous without showing any signs at first glance. By the time I reached home, I had almost convinced myself that it was just a bad night and bad luck. But a small part of me couldn't shake the memory of the smell, the stain, and the idea that I had been sharing a room with something that had been sitting there, unseen, for who knows how long. It made me inspect the air conditioning unit in my own apartment when I got back, double-check the carpets, and think more carefully about where I chose to stay on the road. That motel, that room, the smell, it stuck with me. It was simple, but it was enough to make me feel wary of every motel I passed afterward. The experience left me with a clear lesson. Some things aren't immediately visible, but they leave their mark in ways you can feel, see, and smell, and sometimes that's enough to make you want to leave and never look back. I never went back to that part of the highway. I never stayed at another motel on that route. The smell, the stain, the air conditioning unit, it all stayed with me. It wasn't a ghost or a story to tell around a campfire. It was real, simple, and unmistakable. And for me, that reality was more than enough. I pulled into the small roadside motel, just as the clock in my car blinked past midnight. My arms were stiff from hours of driving, and the highway had been empty for miles, leaving me with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional flash of a passing road sign. The neon sign of the motel buzzed weakly, flickering in and out like it couldn't make up its mind about whether it wanted to work or not. The paint on the building was faded, peeling in places, and the gravel parking lot was uneven, with patches of grass pushing through. I didn't care. I just wanted a bed and somewhere to wash the road dust off my hands. The clerk's office was dimly lit. Behind the counter, the man looked older than I expected, hunched over paperwork or maybe just staring down at the countertop. He didn't look up when I walked in, and when I finally said something, he muttered something I couldn't make out and handed me a key with a simple nod. The key had a number attached to it on a worn, yellowed tag. I took it without a word. The air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and bleach, a combination that made my nose twitch. The fluorescent light above flickered once, then buzzed steadily, as though it had settled into its nightly routine. The hallway to my room was narrow and smelled faintly of carpet cleaner, old wood, and something I couldn't place, like old smoke mixed with damp. The walls were covered in a dull beige wallpaper that had started peeling in the corners. My footsteps echoed a little too loudly on the thin carpet. Each door I passed had its own story, scratches and dents in the wood telling tales of travelers who had stayed before me, some probably in a rush, some probably angry, some probably scared like me. When I finally reached my room, I unlocked the door, and the smell of the room hit me immediately. It was a mix of stale air and whatever cleaning chemicals they used, with a hint of cigarette smoke in the corners. The room was small, one of those where the bed seemed to take up most of the space. The sheets looked freshly changed, and the pillowcases were crisp. I set my bag on the floor and turned on the small lamp on the nightstand. It gave off a weak yellow light, barely enough to push the darkness away from the corners of the room. I stripped off my clothes and climbed into bed, feeling the stiffness in my back start to ease. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the old air conditioning unit. That's when I noticed it, a soft noise coming from the room next door. At first, I told myself it was probably the walls settling or some other guest moving around. I've stayed in old motels before. They always make noises at night. But the noises didn't stop. They were deliberate, measured. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor, a soft tap against the wall, the gentle creak of a door opening and closing. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets closer around myself, pretending that I couldn't hear. But then there were whispers, so low I couldn't make out the words, just that something was being said. The footsteps became more noticeable, pacing slowly across the room next door, pausing occasionally, as if the person was waiting for something or someone. My pulse quickened, and I tried to tell myself to relax. Maybe they were just unpacking or rearranging things. But the timing, the deliberate pauses, the soft but firm taps against the wall, made it impossible to dismiss. I reached for my phone to call the front desk or even the police, but there was no signal. The tiny digital clock on the nightstand glowed 12:37 a.m., and I realized how isolated I was. There was no way to call out, no way to know if anyone was awake, no one to alert. My stomach tightened, and I felt the first real edge of fear crawl up my spine. Then came the footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, careful, deliberate. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, laying flat against the bed, trying not to make a sound. I watched the doorknob tremble slightly, as if someone was testing it. There was a faint scrape, then silence. I stayed completely still, the fear anchoring me to the mattress. After what felt like hours, the footsteps moved again, retreating down the hall. I didn't move for several minutes, too afraid that any movement would draw attention. I sat up slowly, grabbing the small flashlight from the drawer. I shone it toward the door, shining along the edges where the light barely reached. Everything looked normal, just the door, the peeling wallpaper, the thin gap beneath it. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the footsteps were probably someone leaving for the night, that the room next door probably had a guest with a habit of moving furniture late at night. But the uncertainty gnawed at me, made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The night stretched on, slow and heavy. Every small sound became amplified. The hum of the AC, the faint rustling from the vents, the creak of the old ceiling fan above. The whispering from the room next door started again, low and deliberate. I sat on the edge of the bed, flashlight in hand, watching the door. I didn't sleep. Not really. I drifted for short moments only to be jarred awake by the shifting of furniture, the tap against the wall, the soft dragging sound that made my stomach knot. I thought about trying to leave, but the thought of opening the door and stepping into the hallway in the dark, with no one around, made me hesitate. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but the lack of signal made that impossible. I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't just pretend it wasn't happening. I realized I had to wait it out, and so I did. Finally, just as the first hint of dawn started to color the sky through the tiny window, the noises stopped. The whispers faded, the footsteps retreated permanently, and the room next door seemed to settle into an unnatural silence. I didn't dare sleep until the sun was fully up. I packed my things as quietly as I could, trying not to draw attention. I avoided looking at the room next door. I left the key on the counter when I checked out, making sure no one was around to see me leave. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure in the window or someone following me. The motel disappeared behind me, its flickering neon sign the last thing I saw. I told myself it had been an overreaction, that maybe the guest next door had been sleepwalking or struggling with something, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even hours later, as I reached a busy highway and my car hummed along smoothly, I kept glancing at every passing sign, every rest stop, thinking about that night. I didn't go back, and I never stayed at that motel again. Even now, years later, the memory of those footsteps, the whispers, the rattling knob, feels vivid. I can still hear them if I focus, can still feel that sense of being trapped, of not knowing what was behind the walls next door. That night taught me that fear doesn't need ghosts or monsters. Sometimes, the real terror is just knowing there's someone nearby, moving in the dark and not knowing why, and knowing that there's nothing you can do but wait. I arrived at the motel just after midnight, my car headlights cutting through the dark, empty stretch of highway. The place looked tired, the paint on the walls peeling, the neon sign flickering weakly. There was a faint hum from the streetlights outside, and the wind rattled the edges of the old metal awning over the parking lot. I parked, stretched my legs, and glanced around. The lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars tucked into corners, their owners probably asleep already. The air had that late-night, stale quality, mixed with a hint of gasoline from the road and something faintly sour, maybe mildew from the building itself. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, and the carpet felt worn under my shoes. The smell was a mix of cleaner and something older, something the mop couldn't cover up. A janitor was in the corner, pushing a vacuum back and forth with slow, careful motions. He was humming a quiet tune, almost like he wasn't aware of me at all. The sound was oddly comforting at first. I walked up to the counter and grabbed my key from the holder, a cheap plastic card with my room number scribbled in black marker. There was no one else at the desk, no receptionist, just the faint echo of my footsteps across the linoleum. The hallway to my room smelled faintly of cleaning solution, damp carpet, and a faint metallic tang, like old pipes somewhere in the walls. I turned into my room, the door clicking shut behind me. It was small, nothing fancy, just a bed with stiff-looking sheets, a dresser with a cheap mirror, and a tiny bathroom with cracked tiles. I dropped my bag onto the bed and flopped down, exhausted from the long drive and the dull ache in my back. I could hear the hum of the vacuum from the lobby, the occasional scrape of its wheels across the floor, and it reminded me I wasn't alone in the building. After about 20 minutes, a soft, steady knocking came from the door. I thought it must be the cleaning crew returning, maybe to check something or collect trash. I sat up and moved toward the door, still half asleep, half alert. I cracked it open just a sliver, peering into the dim hallway. Nothing. Empty. The carpet was gray under the pale overhead lights. The walls stretched empty in either direction. I frowned, shook my head, and closed the door, thinking maybe it was just a loose panel or the wind rattling the frame. I lay back down, trying to ignore it. But then the knocking started again, sharper this time, louder. Not timid, not uncertain. It had a kind of persistence that felt deliberate. I got up quickly, my heart picking up, and opened the door fully. I flicked the hallway light on. Empty again. The silence was heavier this time, pressing against my ears. No janitor, no staff, no other guests in sight. Just the long, narrow corridor stretching into shadows. I realized then that the vacuum humming I had been hearing from the lobby had stopped. Completely. Dead silent. The janitor had never left the lobby. I knew this because I could see the faint glow from under the lobby door at the far end, where the light reflected off the vacuum cleaner. The knocking didn't stop. It started coming from the wall beside me, soft at first, then louder, like someone moving their fingers against the plaster. I pressed my ear to the door and the wall, trying to make sense of it. Every so often it sounded closer, circling, then fading, but never leaving completely. I locked the door, my hand shaking slightly, and sat down on the edge of the bed. I tried to tell myself it was just an old building, the walls expanding and contracting, plumbing settling, or even the pipes in the bathroom making random thumps. But my eyes kept darting to the door, the hallway, anywhere I might see movement. The hours passed slowly. Every time I closed my eyes, the knocking seemed to resume somewhere near me, almost beneath the floorboards. I could hear it through the walls, sometimes in the ceiling above me, always moving, always just out of reach. It wasn't violent, it wasn't malicious, but it was relentless in a way that got under my skin. I tried turning on the TV to distract myself, but the static hum of the old set sounded eerily similar to the knocking, and I couldn't keep my focus on anything but the sound of it. Eventually, I tried moving to the bathroom to wash my face, hoping some normal routine would calm me down. As I stepped onto the cold tiles, I noticed faint scuff marks along the edge of the doorframe, marks I hadn't seen earlier. They didn't look like anything recent, but they made the space feel smaller, tighter. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection in the mirror, the dim fluorescent light above flickering in a steady rhythm. My own tired, pale face looked back at me, eyes wide, jaw tight. I tried to tell myself I was just anxious, that the building was old, that I was imagining things. I dried my face and sat on the edge of the bed again, the knocking never ceasing, a constant presence just beyond the walls. Hours dragged on. The occasional car outside, the distant highway noise, even the janitor's vacuum returning in the morning, all became part of the soundtrack of that night. I stayed alert, hyper-aware of every creak, every thump, every small shift in the temperature of the room. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The knocking had claimed the night, and I felt like I was trapped inside a machine that had no logic, no explanation. At some point, the first weak gray light of dawn crept through the thin curtains. The knocking slowed, as if sensing the change, retreating, fading. By the time the sun was fully up, the motel corridor was quiet. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway, hesitant. The place looked normal in the daylight, tired but ordinary. The lobby was empty again, the janitor nowhere in sight, as if nothing had happened. I grabbed my bag and checked out quickly, leaving the key in a small box by the counter. As I walked back to my car, the chill of the morning air was welcome. The sound of the highway, the hum of passing vehicles, the occasional bird in the distance, all of it felt alive, grounded, normal. I didn't look back at the motel. I didn't want to know if the knocking would return at night. But I knew one thing. Whatever it had been, it had nothing to do with ghosts or stories. It was just the building, the walls, and the silence of being utterly alone, except for a sound you couldn't explain. I drove away slowly, my hands gripping the wheel, still on edge, but relieved that the daylight made everything seem manageable. The memory of that night stayed with me for years, a quiet reminder that some places have their own rhythm, their own sounds, and sometimes being awake to them is the only way to survive.